Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we're continuing with our 26 Keys to Higher Awareness, and we keep chugging along, and when you keep chugging along, you keep getting up the scale. So we're now up to number 20, which is lots of words. And the theme for number 20 is View Life as a Unity. Swami says, dwell on the harmony that underlies the universe. Seek correlations between events and between circumstances. Consider the sunlight, how it is not an isolated phenomenon, but gives vitality to all living things. Consider the infinite variety in the world around us, how all things are manifestations of a few simple elements. Consider the seeming struggle between life and death, but how death itself only makes way for new life expressions. Ponder the relationship between opposing mental states and how suffering often becomes a portal to deeper experiences of joy. Relationships abound everywhere. A fractured view of things brings mental confusion, but a unitive view expands the consciousness and develops wisdom. It's very long and very interesting. I was remembering reading through it right now for 40 years of my life, from 1971 on. I've been part of Ananda, and in the first 16 years when I lived at Ananda Village, Swami Kriyananda was in residence there, continued after I moved, and I often saw him and was part of the kind of decision-making group in a kind of informal way. I didn't really have a position, but I was around a lot. He let me observe a lot of experiences, and many times over the course of the years that I watched him work, especially when he was really deeply involved in the more of the day-to-day running of Ananda, when it was one community, people would come to him with one dilemma or another, just not knowing how to make something work, either not knowing what the right action was or what the solution was for somebody's personal life, or how we were going to solve the personnel issues, or where the money was going to come from. It could have been any number of things. And I was continually amazed by how Swamiji could always find solutions. It's just like he could just always see a way in which to rearrange things and move forward. And it wasn't even sometimes as if his ideas were so unusual or exotic or anything like that. It was just that he was able to look at a situation and see how it could be resolved in harmony and move forward. When you think of spiritually advanced souls, people tend to imagine that the qualities you're looking for are dramatic. I was actually having a conversation with some friends about, in the early years of Ananda, when a lot of Indian teachers were just beginning to come to America, and Swami Kriyananda was one of the most, remained so through his whole life, prominent sannyasis on the planet. And when teachers would come from India, especially in their early years, they would often come to Ananda to visit him, to see our ashram, and it was also delightful and exciting for us that having this parade of swamis or teachers, men and women both, going through our community was really fun. But unfortunately, sometimes what happened was, I don't know how to put it other than to say that some of these teachers were fishing in someone else's waters, and they were sort of gathering disciples out of our community. And often they would visit when Swami was out of town, and we would host them, and sometimes the results of that weren't positive. And I'm not talking about being competitive to hold on to our own people, but it didn't always serve those who decided, oh, this teacher looks more interesting than what I'm doing, and went off. And so for that reason, Swami decided to not have anyone visit unless he was there. And that worked very well after that. But in all of this, there was this Indian teacher who came, who was well known at that time. He died many years ago, so I won't I don't need to identify him, but he was part of the scene and was a well-known man and was the real thing. He'd been raised in the Himalayas he'd gone to the Himalayas quite young and had been raised among Himalayan yogis. And so he had a lot, he was not an ordinary man. And it was one of the visits, he'd visited when Swami was present, and then he visited when Swami was absent, and we were having a wonderful time hosting him and having satsangs and spending time in his company. He was exotic and he was interesting, and he also had power. And he was holding a satsang, and I was sitting there meditating because it was easy to meditate in his presence. And he started describing some of his earlier life, and I can see it even as I say it. He started talking about being up in the Himalayas and being in these caves and in the society of these sadhus and so on. And all of a sudden I felt it like a force. I felt my mind being drawn into the scene that he was describing. And it wasn't merely that I was hearing it and could picture it, I was actually being sucked into it. And at first I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And then I thought, I did not invite you to come into my mind, because I realized that the man had come into my mind. And I said, I didn't invite you to come into my mind. And I felt quite invaded, and I put up a strong shield like that, and the whole scene went away just in an instant. But what happens to people is you can be in the company of spiritual power, and that power can cause unusual things to happen. And sometimes those unusual things are accompanied by a genuine blissful expansion of consciousness. And sometimes they are a real call from the divine. But sometimes they're not. Because the quality of greatness in a spiritual person is not their power necessarily, although power can be a consequence of spiritual advancement. But power alone is not the definition of spiritual advancement. And coming back to Swami Kriyananda, who, many of us had really profound experiences in his company, but never of that type. Well, speaking for myself, never of that type. It was never an invasion and a taking over. Rather, what the greatness that I perceived in Swamiji over decades was what I was starting to describe at the beginning here. And I'll use his own words. He had such a unitive vision of life. It's like everything for him was always a harmonious flow. Even when there was tremendous difficulty, he was never fragmented. And he never fragmented situations. That's why, as I began to understand, that's why he could always find a solution. Because he never saw any event as an isolated entity. Whereas often in my own mind, it's like this thing would have a kind of circle around it, and it would be impossible to break through, even right as I speak. In this moment, we have a challenge in our community that we've had really for many years, which is this community was established by private investment, because at the time that it was established, we didn't have the money to buy it ourselves. So private investors came in, and there was a certain agreement that we would run it as a for-profit enterprise on a fair return basis, according to any other investment in this area. Well, that was great, and it really worked well, and the people who came in sacrificed a certain amount of financial freedom and a certain amount of financial potential by locking themselves into this enterprise instead. They chose good karma, which was quite an appropriate thing to do. Money you can't take with you, good karma stays with you forever. But over time, it's proved to us that a for-profit model is simply not the right model for a community. It works, it gives us a place to live, it's worked beautifully, and it's been a very positive situation. But a for-profit model is not the right model. It has to be a non-profit, because you can't be operating a community according to profit-making principles for individuals that are not actually even in the community, most of them, you need to be operating the community according to the principles. And profit isn't one of the principles of operating a community. Practicality, sustaining yourself, yes, but not profit, per se. As I said, there's nothing wrong with it, and we're grateful for it, but it's not the right model. And at the age I am in my life, I'm thinking in terms of tying up the loose ends, because it's not that long before I'm off this planet, or at least certainly off of any practical influence. So it's been on my mind. It's been on my mind for years, but it's really been on my mind. But we live in Silicon Valley, which is one of the most inflated real estate markets in the entire world. So the value of this property has skyrocketed to numbers that are in the millions, tens of millions actually. Unbelievable. So it looks really far away. It looks really hard. And I realize even as I'm sitting here, because it's been a lot on my mind in the last couple of weeks, I've been focused on it, that I have isolated that problem as if it were separate from the rest of creation. And once you do that, you have only one side. Everything in the universe is dual. Everything has a pair. When Swami Kriyananda would teach superconscious living, he created a system in 1979, which he called superconscious living, and it was a magnificent, brilliant articulation of the whole spiritual path, really, from the point of view of superconsciousness, or from the point of view of superconsciousness, consciousness, and what he called subconscious, which is all of the samskars and reincarnational memories, and all of the realities that are habitual rather than creative. And the nature of the habitual, the subconscious and the conscious, is that you see all the elements of things, especially the conscious mind. It analyzes and takes things apart. The superconscious is the level of unity, from which, the singularity from which everything is manifested. So for this creation to exist, it's always dual, as Swami describes it. These are words to me, not realizations. The one still presence vibrates. And that's what gives the illusion of the material world. So of necessity, it must always keep alternating, because it's in movement. It must always alternate. The sun rises and sets, the dawn goes into the dark, death is followed by life, life is followed by death, youth is followed by old age, and so on. Everything is dual. Joy is followed by tears. As Master said, pain is an interval between two pleasures, and pleasure is an interval between two pains. How long the interval depends on the karma of the individual, but nonetheless, there you are. Always these doubles. So, in terms of superconsciousness, when Swami was talking in very practical terms, problem solving, which is where I started, when you're on the superconscious level, you're on the level where everything has resolved into unity. And therefore, when you view what may appear to be the fragmented world in which there's a problem, in which we need a new model for our community, but we don't have the money to create it, where there's no unity, you just have an isolated problem. When you look at it superconsciously, because everything ultimately resolves into oneness. And that's how Swami would explain how he would always be able to see the solution, because he would look at the situation from the point of view as this will resolve into the harmony of oneness, so let us resolve it. And then he would just see it differently, and as soon as he would point it out, we would see it the same way. Time after time, he just would come up with an idea or come up with a solution, or this person could handle it and that person could take their job, and so on like this. And so one of the keys to maintaining faith and a positive attitude is always this understanding that no matter what it appears like, everything always resolves back to the oneness of spirit. Every drop of water eventually returns to the sea. I think about that in terms of, we live in very difficult times right now. I fear they may get worse before they get better, but it's certainly bad enough as it is with these crazy, really crazy people doing really crazy things. I heard a quote from Brother Kriyananda, who was a great devotee of Master, who was a monk at SRF. And he said that the world will never know peace and harmony until men and women come together with higher consciousness when they conceive children. Now, quite apart from all the amazing implications of that, I was really just thinking about it. It's like everything in society is conspiring right now to force people to a fragmented view of reality. Even just what people joke about, but is not really a joke, the concentration everybody has on their individual little screens, and even how so much communication takes place in those individual screens instead of one-to-one with people. There's just this isolating quality. And then there's this, the characteristic of modern music just affirms that separation and that egoicness, and there's no melody, there's no harmony. There's just this pounding individual force, and it just brings everybody's consciousness down to a very low vibration. And then what kind of souls would we expect to be drawn into that? Except souls who are on that vibration. And so here we are. It's a huge cosmic plan. I was reading something that Swami wrote about. He was starting with Master's comment, thoughts are universal, not individually rooted. And Swami was talking about it from the cosmic point of view, these great rivers of consciousness moving throughout all creation and sweeping by a planet on this much bigger journey, a movement of energy, and then a planet is drawn into a certain way of thinking, and then the great Master will come and bring a certain way of thinking. Now let me think, where was I going with that thought? Oh yes, but even in these most difficult times, even death, even violent death, nothing is the end. There is no end point. We shift from one vibration of awareness to another, but we don't disappear. I may have mentioned it even in a recent video, forgive me if I have, because it's been so interesting to me lately. We all live with this reality of self-awareness. At different times, I can't concentrate too much on the inescapability of self-awareness because it can make me very anxious. I know that it's a tipping point sometimes for people's mental balance. Not that I'm there anymore, but it's a more recent past life for me, I think, than some, to have sort of had my mental balance tip in the overwhelming existential reality of the inescapable ability of self-awareness, that there's nothing you can do to snuff out self-awareness. Of course, that becomes the incentive for the path, because that's why we end up working so hard to gain mastery over our consciousness, because it's all we ever actually have is our own consciousness, and if we don't have mastery over it, we can be pushed into hell very easily without having to leave our chair in the living room. So I live in my self-awareness, and I live now on planet Earth, and I live in Silicon Valley, and I've been in this body for not quite 70 years, and I have all these identifications. But where was I before I was here? There must have been an entire other set of identifications that I lived in. In fact, for a long time in my life, and it's stopped, and I don't know whether it's stopped or I've just stopped being aware of it. I used to have this weird phenomenon as I was falling asleep. It didn't happen every night, but it happened often. that as I was falling asleep, I would move into an extremely active world. And I would move into that active world like a moving sidewalk. I would step into a spot where I had been. I'd just step right in and keep going. And then I would come back to this world just slightly, long enough to think, what is this? And then I would remember, oh, this is what I do when I go to sleep. This is where I am when I go to sleep. It was like in the daytime, I lived in the daytime on this planet. I lived in this world, and in the nighttime when my body was asleep, I lived in that world. And then I would lose consciousness. So it wasn't like I really astral traveled or had samadhi experiences, but I would catch that transition. Was it pure subconscious imagination? I really haven't the foggiest idea, but it was interesting how consistent it was. As I say, without content. It wasn't like I could come back and tell you the plot of that story. But what that tells me is that after I die, I will be just as much myself. I will be just as much aware somewhere else. And the story will just keep going. There'll be no end to the story. I'll just step out of this, as I have obviously stepped out of many other realities, previous incarnations, childhood even. Who knows, astral universes? Who knows? I don't remember. But I sort of remember. It's like you have an internal impression without having a clear picture. There's a lot of things that I know without knowing why I know them. That's the only way I can put it. Because they're intuitions, I guess is the right word. So I think of, as I mentioned to all of my friend Tushti, who is somewhere completely conscious. She's just not here. Now, what that says to me is the story isn't finished. And the masters tell us the story doesn't finish until we merge back into God. Yogananda was asked once, is there any end to evolution? And he said, no, we keep on evolving until we achieve endlessness. So wherever we are, if there is even the slightest remaining sense of separation, then we're not finished. We have to keep going. So that means, and that end point, according to all the masters, and according to what little I have experienced, that end point is bliss. All of this duality of I suffer, I want, I'm deprived, I need, all of it resolves into simply I am, and I am bliss. Which means at any point when we're not in that state of unity, for whatever reason, whatever anxiety we may have, whatever, fear for ourselves, for our children, for our well-being, for how we're ever going to shift this community from a profit to a non-profit model without all those millions of dollars. Whatever those questions are, we're just not at the end of the story. I've been fond of saying, when somebody sometimes presents to me a great conundrum that they're dealing with, I have sometimes said, well, something will happen. And something always happens. And at first people sort of hear that as, like I've said something good will happen. No, I haven't said something good will happen. I've just said something will happen, because something always happens. So whatever it is that we're dealing with now, we won't be dealing with it forever, because something will happen. And sometimes things will get much worse, because they just don't always get immediately better. It's just not the divine plot for them to get immediately better. The lessons that we have to learn are not going to be learned by them getting immediately better. It's just that something will happen, and then we'll go on and on. So Swami's telling us now, 26 keys to greater awareness, number 20, is to see life as the unity. Instead of just seeing that there's a problem here, even if we don't know what it is, to have always in our mind that this is only half a circle, everything's only half. There's got to be the other side of it, which means also when miserable things happen, and miserable things do happen, nothing is the end of the story. It's just, we're just moving along. We're making a full circle, or a perfect infinity sign if you want. And we're just not done until we've gotten there. It takes great courage to persevere, but emphasizing, and this is how Swami is suggesting it to us, to always look at the world with this, without ever forgetting that it always comes back. And he says even death, gives space for new life. We have a farm. Our community has a farm now, and they grow a lot of great vegetables, and many of us are signed up for the CSA, the Community Supported Agriculture, and every week we get this big box and we open it up, and what do you know, something else is in there. Just all these marvelous, fresh, just harvested, organically grown vegetables and so on. And because I use so many of these vegetables and live alone, sometimes I can't quite finish everything, or there's lots of waste. But this delightful system we have is that there's a compost pile just right, just really literally a few steps out the back door. So whenever I can't eat everything, or when I have all the stuff that you accumulate when you're using whole vegetables, peels and leaves and things, I just take it out there. And I'm not a gardener of any kind, but I watch my little compost, I call it mine because I contribute so much to it. I watch my little compost pile transmute itself. And then I see it spread out on the garden, then I see a tomato plant coming up, and I'm going to pick the tomato. And I mean, it's about the most obvious image there is in the world, but sometimes the simple is good. Simple is very good, because everything just keeps moving. And what looks like waste, or what looks like death, dead, rotten, whatever it might be, it just turns into something else. No different with us. My emotional state, my anxieties, my successes, my failures, all of them. They're all just, I'm going to shift it to grist for the mill, or garbage for the compost heap. That's just going to start shifting into something else. Now, it's very interesting, because that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have experiences that are really the pain between the pleasures, because there are many things that you do feel fragmented and you do feel lost, and many things are heartbreaking. We have been treated in the last few weeks to some really horrendous examples of cruel madness, and people's lives have been ended. And then all you can see is all the fragmentation that's going to take place. Babies left without parents, wives or husbands left without spouses, parents left without children. It's a big, long line. But we need to view life as a unity, and that it's always moving, and there's this tremendous force behind it. This force that we ourselves don't always remember even, but the force of our own destiny. When we have very difficult lessons that we have to learn through very difficult circumstances. A friend of mine whose husband died from illness, but nonetheless it was an unexpected death. Just she didn't know he was that close. I don't think he did either. So it was a transition she had to go through. But a decade, 15 years later, she says, I have a life now that I could never have had if my husband hadn't died. And she had to admit that there were many wonderful features to her life that she would never experience if her husband hadn't died. So she herself just presented it as not really quite knowing how to put it all together. So what should I feel about him dying? She certainly was heartbroken when he left as early as he did in their life together. But nonetheless, she saw that experience had proved to be the rich addition that created a whole new plant that could never have grown if it hadn't been fertilized, so to speak, with that other experience. So when many years ago I was puzzled by a certain dilemma. I've told this story before, so forgive me for those of you who've heard it. But being raised Jewish, I would contemplate the concentration camps a lot. I still do. I measure everything. My measure of how bad is this is generally against a concentration camp. And my measure of how much courage do I have this morning is generally the concept of a concentration camp, which I now consider all to the good. I don't consider it to be a morbid preoccupation. I think it helps me keep perspective. But I used to think a lot about how do you behave when you're so helpless? What is the right behavior? And do you do something? Do you do a foolish, brave act, or do you think in a more considered way and not interfere? When the guard begins to beat the person standing next to you, that was my rather morbid image. And when I finally had the chance to ask Swami Kriyananda that question, I finally realized I had someone I could ask. His answer, as always, just moved way outside of where I was even seeing it. And he said quite simply, you're asking, how do you know in the moment what God wants you to do? And he said, the only way you can know under that much pressure in a crisis is if it is your habitual way of thinking. If you've gotten in the habit, practice when it's easier is how I've translated that. When there's very little at stake, you want to be always pulling your mind to the highest level. When you feel like there's no incentive to pull your mind to the highest level, that's when you really have to practice doing it. So it's a very good practice, and this is where Swami says to contemplate the unity of life at all times. When he said we see circumstances as isolated, like, somebody loses their money, or somebody has an accident in a car, or somebody is the victim of a burglary, or someone actively does something and behaves illegally and gets caught. And we see that as separate. But there's no possibility that it can be a separate circumstance. It has to be part of a bigger chain of events that started a long time ago and is not going to finish for a long time. Also, how much calmer that makes us. And I have been prone to worry about the circumstance of our community, and so I'm talking to myself when I say this. But if God gives you half of it, He's going to give you the rest of it sooner or later. Something will happen. It will just, and I don't mean that it will necessarily resolve in exactly the way I want it to, but nothing ever stays the same. No circumstance is isolated. It's all part of a bigger flow. And if we're always thinking in terms of how it all fits together, then our anxiety in the moment is greatly reduced. Among other things, we become interested. I wonder how this is going to resolve. I wonder how this is going to turn out to be a good thing. It's been comfort to me at times when I've had to face circumstances I really didn't want to face. And even though I wasn't enjoying them at all, I could still say to God, I wonder what good thing you have planned here. I wonder how you're going to make this work out in a good way. I wonder how the other side of this is going to manifest. And I also think, what was the other side of it before? What violation of divine law did I commit that now has to be pushed over to this balancing side? It's always, we're always living in this necessity to learn. And there's always just more and more in our hearts that has to be resolved. I recall Swami Kriyananda said something once. He sort of, when I was writing the book I wrote about him, Swami Kriyananda, as we have known him, he wouldn't let me print this exactly as he said it, because he didn't feel it was right to print it. But essentially what he said is he had no vrittis in his chakras. How he said it was he had no subconscious. And when I thought about that, I realized what that meant. Now, subconscious in the way he means it. Subconscious is that habit which is stored, which is where energy is locked. That's what a subconscious, that's what a vritti in the chakra is that energy is locked because there's a center point of attachment or desire. You can call it a center point of unlearned lesson. There's some aspect of divine truth that we haven't fully embraced. I need to be healthy to be happy. I need to be married not to feel lonely. I need for my children to behave a certain way. I want, whatever it is, there's some attachment being held there, and there's energy spinning around it, and then that blocks us from being able to be like the sages described in the Bhagavad Gita, where everything looks the same. A cloud of earth or a bar of gold, to the yogi it looks just the same. And what that means is that there's no point of attachment to which things must be anchored. See, for us, we have a point of attachment, and so it goes against our attachment, and we're tense, and we have to pull it back to here, and it goes the way we want it, and we're relieved, and we want it to stay. And then it's because there's always some point of attachment that we're always trying to balance. Think of the stories of the great masters, like there's a story told in Autobiography of a Yogi of the policeman. There was a sadhu, a great sadhu, and the policemen were looking for a criminal, and they mistakenly thought that sadhu was the criminal, and they pursued him and ordered him to stop, and the criminal wouldn't stop. And so the story is told that the policeman used his machete and cut off the man's arm. Seems a rather extreme measure, just because he wouldn't stop. But anyway, that's how the story is told. But the sadhu didn't even flinch. I mean, most of us, certainly a point of attachment around which everything else revolves is that I am this body, and this is who I am. And if something like a big piece of it being cut off, that creates a certain reaction within us. But this sadhu was so without any held, fixed ideas, that even when his arm was taken off, he simply didn't respond. It was just something else that happened. And then he turned to the policeman and said, "I'm not the man you're looking for," even though they hadn't even really explained it to him. And then he put the arm back on and just healed himself and went on. Of course, the ability to heal yourself like that certainly creates a certain detachment to the body, but I would be doing him a disservice to say that was why he was detached. It doesn't matter, I can fix it. The reason he was detached is because in or out of his body, what difference did it make to him? It was all just the same reality. So our vrittis is where, in each of the chakras, we have this center point of attachment. And then a great deal of energy circulates to maintain that center point of attachment. I am this body. If this body is in pain, I will suffer. I must do what I can not to suffer. And on down the list, as I say. The whole process of the spiritual path and the practice of Kriya is dissolving those vrittis in the spine. What we do is we dissolve the center point of attachment by making our only attachment at the spiritual eye, which is to say, I live for God alone and to do His will. And I want what God wants for me. And there is no other center point of attachment. And that allows the sadhu to just be pursued down the street and have his arm cut off or not cut off. It allowed Jesus to accept crucifixion and say, even now my Father could send legions of angels to rescue me, but is not going to, because that's not what's supposed to happen here. And just with perfect ease, just accept it. Master could leave his homeland and come to America. Just with perfect ease, just accept it. Persecution or praise, it doesn't make any difference. When Swami Kriyananda was being vilified in these horrible trumped-up lawsuits that were against him, and he had to sit in court and listen to all this testimony about what an egregious, monstrous person he was. Ridiculous. He said, here's what he actually said later. He said, I just went into the astral world. So he sat with his body in the courtroom and stared out, but he just put his consciousness somewhere else. It just wasn't worth it to him to just stay there, because there was nothing happening there that mattered. But nor was he tense about it. It was, I am what I am before my conscience and God, and whatever they say, it doesn't make me a whit better or a whit worse. I just am what I am. But what he was saying was, in this other context, was there was no subconscious. There were no fixed points around which he was forced to circulate. That it was all free and in harmony with the divine spirit. That was quite a statement. That's why he said, he wouldn't let. Well, the actual words were, he wouldn't let me print it. He just said, I just don't want that said. I said, but you said it, sir. He said, I may have, but I don't want you to print it. So I found some way to tone it down a little bit that made it work, and he accepted it from me. There's only a couple of things in the book. The other thing he wouldn't let me print was when he said he actually took on the karma. When Ananda Assisi was sued, these things happen, you see, in all spiritual works. A disgruntled ex-member who was mentally unbalanced, and his hobby in life was filing frivolous lawsuits. He filed one against us, but it got a little traction. And in Italy, it was fascinating. What were civil charges in America, where it was only a matter of money, in Italy became criminal charges. Mafioso-like abuse of power. And so 7 or 9 of our people were actually arrested and taken to jail. Several of them were Americans, and as Americans we became quite outraged, but we weren't in America, we were in Italy. It's not a police state by any means, but we got caught in that. They were in jail about 7 days. We didn't know it at the time how long they'd be there. Swami was in India. He would have been arrested if he'd been in Italy, but he was in India. And he was quite unwell, and he couldn't come back to Italy. No one wanted him to come back to Italy because he would have been arrested, but he thought it was cowardly not to come back. But the doctors wouldn't let him fly. It was a very interesting karmic moment. So he said he prayed to be able to help. And that night he slipped in the bathroom. He fell in the bathroom. It was funny. He was very exact about it. He said, I didn't slip, I fell. I never quite knew exactly what he meant. Maybe Satan pushed him down, I don't know. But he fell, and he fell across the edge of the shower and shattered his ribs, and it was horrid, and it went on for a long, long time. But he just said, I prayed to be able to help in Assisi, and then I fell and cracked my ribs. And then he said, I hope it helps. Meaning, I've used my body to take the karma. I hope it helps. But he didn't want me to say that. I think he said he was taking the karma, but he wouldn't let me say that. I finally said, again, sir, it's the truth. He said, yes, but he was speaking for himself. He said, I shouldn't have said it. I don't want to have said it. He said it's, well, he didn't explain, actually, but I understood later. It's a sacred self-offering, and it's not something you speak about. When you do something divinely for God, you don't advertise it. It's a very important point. I recently was in a conversation with someone who reminded me of what they'd given up in order to help this work. And I thought to myself, I'm glad you did it, but I'm sorry you feel the need to keep speaking about it. Because it's a privilege to do it. It's not something that you make a mark in the sand or that you advertise to other people. It's a privilege to do it, and it's a sacred gift of your own heart. And if you make a point of how generous you are generous, but it's unfortunate. It brings it down to a different level. So when Swami was talking about, going back to where I was, not having these vrittis in his spine, it was like there's no duality. Because to have a vritti means you have a fixed point of attachment. I mean, what is attachment? Attachment says, this is how it has to be. And how is there ever more of a definition of duality than saying, I want this to remain fixed? In this entire fluctuating universe, in which everything is dual and nothing ever stays the same, I'm going to pull out this piece and I'm going to hold it. I'm always going to have money. This investment is going to work. I'm going to be protected. I was remembering there was a period of time in Ananda's development, and these things are very subtle, so don't misunderstand me. Well, there was a period of time in the whole yoga movement which Swamiji was quite concerned about, and it was It was integrated to the litigations we went through, and part of the reason why I believe Swami accepted the karma of that litigation was that somebody owes me, and somebody's supposed to take care of me, and I am a victim. I am not really responsible. You didn't behave properly. And the yoga movement, which started in the 70s here and got very dynamic for a while, sort of started slipping in that direction, that we're not only going to be living for God, but we're also going to bring in the principles of self-assertion and not really overcome the ego, just make it work a lot better. A lot of what's passed for spiritual teaching, what masquerades as spiritual teaching in America, is really just developing the ego, which is better than having it just be moribund or passive. The ego, I mean, it's a necessary stage on the spiritual path to be able to have dynamic willpower. And self-interest is a powerful way to develop dynamic willpower, and often people will not develop dynamic willpower for altruistic reasons unless they have first developed it for selfish reasons, because that's just how evolution goes. Your first willingness to use willpower is because it makes my life better. But that was really coming into the yoga movement, a lot of pseudo-psychology that was about how everybody's supposed to behave. And there got to be this little wave that went through Ananda about how we have to create a safe environment, and I thought I was safe here, and I find out that I'm not safe here. And yes, understand me properly. Certainly you don't want to create an environment in which people feel abused. That's certainly not what you're trying to do by any means. But the spiritual path is not about safety. The spiritual path is about absolute jeopardy. Complete jeopardy. Everything is jeopardized. Absolutely everything is jeopardized. And the only security there is God. There was an exchange that I read between Swami and this person, and the person wanted to come to Ananda but wanted Swami to assure her that she would have a place to live and a job. And for very specific reasons, Swami said, I totally refuse to assure you of such a thing. He said, anyone who comes to Ananda thinking about what they're going to get for themselves, this isn't their home. This is not a place where you think about what I'm going to get for myself. This is a place where you think, how can I give everything? And of course the irony is that once you enter into the stream of how can I give everything, then you enter also into a stream of prosperity that's harder to get into if you're always, separating yourself out, seeing yourself as different. When I first came to the community, it was very interesting. Really first came, summer of 1971. I remember I'd always been a relatively solitary person. Not really because I was a hermit type, but I hadn't met any kindred spirits. Or just a few. I didn't have any people. So I didn't have any people. I didn't know who my people were. So I stayed pretty much to myself because I just didn't know where else to go. A few friends here and there. I wasn't that extreme. But when I came to Ananda, suddenly I was in a community. A spiritual community is the most interesting place because the basis of your friendship is not your affinity, your personal affinity. You will also have personal affinity, I've learned, with some people. But as Swamiji said, you really only, in one lifetime, you only have a few of those. It's just the way life is. But everybody's your brother and sister within the community. And gradually everybody in the world is your brother and sister, but it's easier to start in the community. But I also realized in community, and I watched, some people, a close friend of mine who came about the same time I did, he just couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand having all those people in his business, is the way he sort of thought about it. It was just like he just didn't want community like that, even though you think you do. But when you're in community, everybody knows your life. And I remember I was standing at this particular spot the little hallway between what was then the kitchen and the dining room, and there must have been a bulletin board there. I seem to remember standing looking at a bulletin board. And I was going through some rather tumultuous personal things at that point, because I was 24 years old and I was going through tumultuous personal things. That's what I did for quite a long time there. That was my job for quite a few years. And very private, tumultuous personal things, which it went more like this. There must have been something on the bulletin board that made me aware of some other people's lives, and I discovered I have a strong intuitive sense of other people's realities, not to the point where I can hold your shoe and read your karma, but I'm observant, more on the Sherlock Holmes type. I'm observant and I can sort of sense what's going on. So I was standing there being conscious of the fact that many other people were also having tumultuous personal experiences, because we were all in our 20s, and that's what was a job for all of us we were doing. And I was aware, in a perfectly kindly way, but I knew a lot about stuff that was going on that hadn't necessarily been told to me. I just knew it. And then, in the way these eerie things work, I suddenly realized that just as I knew other people's lives, they knew my life. And it was actually the result was never in doubt, but nonetheless it was a real turning point, because I stood there and I thought to myself, either you surrender to this reality for the rest of your life, or you're really not ever going to be happy here. And I remember just having to let go of that sense of separation, and to a certain extent sense of privacy, which had always defined me up until that point. Just to realize that this is a process of becoming someone else, and I just have to surrender to it. And in the context of we need to create a safe environment, no, actually, we should always feel threatened. I don't mean uncomfortable, but we should always feel that our most cherished preconceptions are subject to complete destruction at any moment, because in truth they are. So why are we here? It's not always easy to remember that, and it's not always fun, but why else are we here? Swamiji has often commented, and it's more interesting now. He commented in 1971 and 72, a long time ago. Someday, he said, life at Ananda will become in and of itself so enjoyable that will become the definition. We have these lovely homes in the country, we have all our good friends, we have nice work, it's a good place for our children, and that will become in people's minds what it means to live at Ananda, instead of this is a place of absolute total transformation, and the place where we shed all limitations and come to realize God. And I don't mean that you can't have a nice home in the country and have a lovely place for your children and so on. What you're doing outwardly is not the definition of who you are. It's what you're doing inwardly and what your attitude toward what you're doing is, and where meaning comes to you. And Ananda has what I've always called a magnetic integrity, which is that the grace of the masters is a tangible force. And when you step inside that circle of grace, you will be changed. That doesn't mean you have to suffer. It doesn't mean you have to lose what you love. I hear people talk in such a way, it's like, they know they're going to have to suffer. No, actually, you don't have to suffer. You have to change, but you don't have to suffer. So it just depends on how fixed you are in your self-definition and your definition of happiness. Someone I knew going through what appeared to be a very difficult transition, Swami's comment was simply, "Why are you taking this so hard?" Any objective person could make a big list of why they were taking it so hard. But it was still the right question. Why are you taking this so hard? And I've used that inside myself a lot. Why am I taking this so hard? What do I think will come to me by resisting? And that's that vritti in the spine, that fixed point that is afraid and has defined itself by circumstances staying a certain way, and then circumstances don't. There they go, just spinning down. And this is where Swami was saying to us about seeing life as a unity. Don't see those circumstances as isolated. Look for the correlations. Look for the relationships. Look how one thing leads to another. Look how this is an adventure into something else. Where are we coming? Where have we come from, and where are we going? I mean, at the very least, like whatever I did to draw this karma to me, I never want to see it again. So I need to behave in such a way that it never comes back. Meaning, the more I resist. Swami said once, and I know it's true, he said, anything that you're afraid of is karma that you still have to work out. And of course, the list of what I'm afraid of is really gigantic. But there it is. I have to say it honestly. But it's very interesting to try to penetrate when it comes to you to have to do it, to the heart of what am I afraid of? What am I afraid of? Why do I fear this? What do I think will happen? I remember when I first moved here. I lived in Ananda Village for 16 years, and then moved here, meaning Silicon Valley, Palo Alto. And Swami Kriyananda was still at Ananda Village, and he was and is. He was the center of my world. And being physically separated from him when he was still available. I mean, when he moved to India and I was in America, or moved to Italy or something, the separation, there was no access, but he was so close, but not close. And he would come to visit. He came to visit often. Thank you. Thank you, sir, for doing that. But every time he'd leave, I would just be distraught for days. And he would call. I mean, in retrospect, but at the time there you have it. You suffer. I suffered. And then one day I said to myself, even if you tried to turn the clock back and go back to where you were, it's not what God wants for you. So you would not find in it the happiness that you think you would find. Oh. You think that would have been obvious earlier. But this is what God wants of me. How can I even imagine for a moment that in resisting God's will, I'll find greater happiness than I will find in going with it? And it's just these are very key concepts. And when life has pushed you into a circumstance that was not on your own wish list, even to imagine that I would be happier if this weren't happening, you're actually saying, if I rebel against God's will, then I'm going to feel better. What are the chances? What do you think are the chances? If I resist this karma, that I'm going to be happier than if I courageously accept it. What am I afraid of? That was also one of Swamiji's wonderful answers to me when I said I was having trouble knowing what God wanted. And it was actually I who figured it out from what he said to me, but I realized, I can't hear it. Swami just said, it's easy to know what God wants, and I did not find it easy. And when I meditated on it, it was very simple. It was because I was afraid. I was really afraid that God's will was going to be more challenging than, a bigger challenge than I wanted. Whether it was a bigger challenge than I could handle, I don't know. But it was certainly a bigger challenge than I wanted. Well, of course, it's never a bigger challenge than you can handle. It wouldn't be magnetically drawn to you. The magnetism that draws the karma to you is exactly in proportion to the magnitude of the karma. That's how it works. God never sends you a test you can't handle. But just that, what am I afraid of? And I found that to be so helpful for just unraveling the inner mystery. What am I afraid of? And why am I afraid of it? And how do I imagine I could be happier resisting God's will than accepting it with courage? That's the ultimate unity. Everything, as Swami says, emanates from the few simple elements. Everything emanates from Divine Mother taking us by the hand and leading us through delusion to freedom. And that's the simple force that unifies all our experiences. And the more we live and walk that path, then the more everything that truly fulfills us comes to us. So, God bless you.